Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to the plains of northern Syria, to a bend in the Orontes River, to witness the largest chariot battle in recorded human history. Not the sanitized version carved into temple walls by a man who wanted history to remember him as an invincible hero chosen by the gods. We are going to look underneath that propaganda at what modern military historians, reading between the lines of ancient inscriptions and comparing them carefully against the independent records left by the other side, believe actually happened on that catastrophic day in approximately 1274 BCE. And before we begin, let me tell you 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, the young pharaoh Ramesses II, in only his 5th year on the throne, walked directly into a trap so complete and so devastating that his entire army should have been destroyed and his own life should have ended on that battlefield. He was deceived by 2 enemy spies who deliberately fed him false information about where his enemy was hiding. He split his forces across many miles of open terrain without any knowledge of the true danger closing in around him, and he found himself, at one specific and terrifying moment, essentially surrounded by thousands of enemy chariots with only his personal household guard and his own 2 hands to fight with. This is not exaggeration for dramatic effect. The ancient Egyptian texts themselves, despite being composed specifically to glorify Ramesses for eternity, accidentally preserve enough incidental detail about the crisis that modern historians have been able to reconstruct just how close Egypt came to losing both its king and quite possibly the entire war in the span of a single catastrophic afternoon. Second, this battle, despite being commemorated on more Egyptian temple walls than almost any other single military event in the nation's 3,000-year recorded history, was very likely not the clean, glorious victory that Ramesses claimed it to be. Compare his elaborate account, carved in stone and repeated across multiple monuments, to the far more modest record left behind by the Hittite Empire, his enemy in this conflict, and a very different picture begins to emerge from the gaps and silences between the 2 versions. The Egyptian army, despite Ramesses' claims of triumph, withdrew from the battlefield entirely. The city they had marched hundreds of miles specifically to capture remained firmly in enemy hands. And 16 years later, the 2 exhausted empires would sign what many historians consider the oldest surviving comprehensive peace treaty in human history, a document that reads far less like the celebratory aftermath of a glorious triumph and far more like 2 exhausted powers who had fought each other to a bloody, inconclusive standstill and finally recognized that neither could destroy the other. Third, the specific military technology at the absolute center of this battle, the light, fast, 2-man Bronze Age war chariot, represented the cutting edge of ancient military engineering, roughly equivalent in its strategic and psychological impact to what the tank would represent more than 3,000 years later. The Battle of Kadesh brought together, by conservative modern scholarly estimates, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 chariots converging on a single relatively confined battlefield, a concentration of this specific weapons platform larger than has ever been assembled in one place before or since in the entire recorded history of chariot warfare. Understanding this single battle means understanding a very specific, very narrow window in military history when the chariot was the supreme weapon of its age, and when only the very greatest empires on Earth possessed the resources, the breeding programs, the metalworking capacity, and the organizational sophistication necessary to field thousands of these machines simultaneously on a single day. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down, blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story. Same pace, lights always low. Let's begin. to understand why two of the ancient world's greatest powers marched their armies hundreds of miles across desert and mountain to fight over a relatively modest fortified city in northern Syria, we need to step back considerably and understand the broader world these two empires inhabited, the specific piece of geography that made this particular patch of land worth so much accumulated blood, and the decades of slowly building tension that led inevitably toward this single explosive confrontation. By the middle of the 13th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean and the wider Near East were dominated by a relatively small handful of major imperial powers who existed in a constant, shifting state of rivalry, occasionally finding themselves allied against shared external threats, but far more often maneuvering continuously against one another for territorial advantage, control of trade routes, and the loyalty of the smaller kingdoms caught between them. Egypt, under the ambitious new kingdom pharaohs who had spent the preceding 2 centuries transforming their nation from a regional power into a genuine empire, controlled territory stretching from Nubia far to the south, up through the entire length of the fertile Nile Valley, and northward along the eastern Mediterranean coastline into the region we would today broadly call the Levant, a territory encompassing significant portions of what is now modern Israel, Lebanon, and southern Syria. To the north and east, occupying the rugged highland plateau of central Anatolia in what is now modern Turkey, lay the Hittite Empire, a formidable and highly organized power whose kings had, over the preceding century, methodically expanded their zone of control steadily southward, absorbing smaller independent kingdoms one by one and establishing vassal relationships with local rulers, pushing their own sphere of political influence deeper and deeper into Syria, directly into territory that Egypt had long considered to fall naturally within its own ancient and rightful sphere of influence, territory that Egyptian pharaohs going back generations had fought to control, taxed, and drawn resources from. Between these two steadily expanding imperial powers lay an unstable buffer zone comprising dozens of smaller kingdoms and independent city-states, local rulers who frequently found themselves caught in a genuinely impossible political position, forced again and again to choose allegiance to whichever great power seemed strongest and most threatening at any given specific moment, and who often switched their declared loyalty from one empire to the other whenever circumstances shifted, because their continued survival as independent or semi-independent rulers depended entirely on correctly reading which direction the prevailing winds of imperial power happened to be blowing in any given year. The city of Kadesh itself, located on a strategic bend of the Orontes River in what is now western Syria, near the modern border with Lebanon, sat at one of the single most strategically critical crossroads in this entire heavily contested frontier zone. Whoever controlled Kadesh controlled direct access to several major regional trade routes, controlled a critically important crossing point on the Orontes River that any army moving north or south through the region would need to use, and effectively controlled the practical military capability to project further armed force either deeper into contested Syrian territory or, alternatively, southward into the heart of Egyptian-controlled Canaan. It had changed hands multiple times across the preceding decades. Ramesses' own father, the pharaoh Seti I, had personally campaigned in this exact same contested region during his own reign, and Egyptian inscriptions record that he had, at one specific point, successfully captured Kadesh himself, only for the city to fall back under renewed Hittite influence in the years and campaigns that followed his initial conquest, a pattern of contested control that had repeated itself for generations. By the time young Ramesses II formally ascended to the Egyptian throne around 1279 BCE, following his father's death after a long and militarily active reign, the overall situation in Syria had become, from the specific perspective of Egyptian royal ideology and dynastic pride, genuinely intolerable. The Hittite king of this period, Muwatalli II, had spent years methodically consolidating an enormous and diverse military coalition drawn from numerous allied and vassal states scattered across Anatolia and northern Syria, and Kadesh itself had, by this point, firmly and unambiguously aligned itself within the Hittite sphere of political and military influence. For a young, intensely ambitious new pharaoh determined from the very beginning of his reign to prove himself decisively as a warrior king standing fully in the tradition of Egypt's most celebrated and most militarily successful predecessors, reclaiming Kadesh from Hittite control was not simply a matter of practical strategic necessity, though it was certainly that as well. It represented, in the deepest sense, a matter of personal legitimacy, dynastic pride, and religious obligation, an essential opportunity to demonstrate conclusively to his own royal court, to the broader Egyptian population, and crucially to the permanent judgment of history itself, that he possessed the genuine military capability, the personal courage, and the divine favor necessary to stand as an equal alongside the great warrior pharaohs who had come before him. The Egypt that Ramesses inherited was itself the product of a specific and relatively recent historical trauma, one that shaped the entire strategic thinking of the New Kingdom period, and that helps explain the almost obsessive Egyptian concern with controlling this specific stretch of Syrian territory. Roughly 2.5 centuries before Ramesses came to power, Egypt had suffered through what modern historians call the Second Intermediate Period, a time of internal fragmentation during which a foreign people known as the Hyksos had managed to establish control over significant portions of the Nile Delta, ruling as pharaohs in their own right from their capital at Avaris for well over a century. The eventual expulsion of the Hyksos by the founders of the New Kingdom had left a permanent mark on Egyptian strategic culture, an enduring conviction that Egypt's security depended fundamentally on controlling the approaches through Canaan and Syria that any future invader might use to threaten the Delta again. This is not simply modern historical speculation. The military campaigns of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Seti I, and now Ramesses II, extending across nearly 2 centuries of sustained Egyptian foreign policy, reveal a remarkably consistent strategic logic. Push the frontier as far north as practically possible, establish loyal or at least intimidated vassal states throughout the Levant, and prevent any single rival power from consolidating enough regional strength to threaten Egypt proper. The Egyptian war machine. Let's spend considerable time now examining the specific army that young Ramesses assembled for this ambitious campaign, because understanding the precise internal structure, the equipment, and the underlying military doctrine of the New Kingdom Egyptian military helps explain both exactly how this near catastrophe was allowed to happen and, equally important, precisely how Egypt ultimately managed to survive it. By the era of Ramesses II, the Egyptian military establishment had evolved and matured considerably from the somewhat more limited and improvised forces of earlier historical periods. The mature New Kingdom military was organized systematically into 4 major divisions, each one formally named after and dedicated to a major Egyptian deity. The division of Ammonius, considered the premier and most prestigious formation and traditionally accompanying the pharaoh himself, the division of Ra, the division of Ta, and the division of Set. Each of these 4 major divisions functioned, at least in theory and in standard operational doctrine, as something close to a complete and self-sufficient army in its own right, containing within its own organizational structure both dedicated infantry contingents and its own attached chariot corps, along with its own internal command structure and its own logistical and supply apparatus, theoretically capable of operating independently for limited periods if battlefield circumstances made such independent action necessary, though the standard and intended campaign strategy called for all 4 divisions to advance together, march in coordinated sequence, and ultimately fight as a single, unified, mutually supporting military force. Each of these 4 divisions likely numbered, according to the careful estimates of modern military historians working from the fragmentary evidence available, somewhere in the general range of 5,000 fighting men, giving Ramesses a combined total force, when the entire army was fully assembled and marching together, of approximately 20,000 soldiers in total. This represented, by any reasonable standard, a genuinely massive logistical and organizational undertaking for any Bronze Age power to successfully organize, adequately supply with food and water, and successfully march across many hundreds of miles of often hostile, semi-hostile, or at best unreliably neutral territory stretching from the Egyptian heartland all the way to the distant Syrian frontier. Understanding the sheer logistical achievement this represents requires some appreciation for what feeding 20,000 men and their accompanying horses actually meant on a daily basis. Modern calculations based on comparable pre-modern armies suggest that a force of this size, together with its associated chariot horses, pack animals, and camp followers, would have required something in the range of 20 to 30 tons of grain and other foodstuffs every single day simply to maintain basic operational capability, along with correspondingly enormous quantities of water. Particularly challenging in the semi-arid terrain the army needed to cross during significant portions of its march. This meant that the Egyptian state had spent months, quite possibly the better part of a full year, in careful preparatory planning before the campaign ever began, establishing supply depots along the intended route of march, negotiating or coercing agreements with local rulers along the way to provide provisions and water access, and organizing the enormous baggage train of carts, pack donkeys, and support personnel that would be required to keep the fighting force adequately supplied throughout an extended campaign potentially lasting several months. The infantry soldiers who constituted the numerical bulk of these 4 divisions were organized and equipped according to specific, well-established, and highly standardized conventions that had developed and been refined over many generations of accumulated Egyptian military tradition and battlefield experience. The core standard infantry weapon throughout this period remained the bow, and specifically Egypt's own sophisticated composite bow technology, a weapon carefully constructed through a laborious lamination process combining multiple layers of wood, animal horn, and sinew, a construction method that gave the finished weapon significantly greater power, range, and penetrating force than a comparatively simple wooden self-bow could ever achieve, allowing well-trained Egyptian archers to engage, approaching enemy forces effectively at considerable distance, well before the more dangerous and less predictable phase of direct close combat became militarily necessary or unavoidable. The production of these composite bows was itself a specialized craft requiring considerable time and expertise. A skilled bow maker needed to carefully select and season appropriate wood for the core of the weapon, then apply layers of horn on the belly of the bow, which would be compressed under tension, and sinew on the back, which would stretch under tension, bonding these different materials together with animal-based glues in a process that could take a full year or more from initial construction to a bow ready for actual military use. The Egyptian state maintained dedicated workshops specifically for the production and maintenance of military equipment, and the sheer scale of weapons production required to equip an army of 20,000 men, along with maintaining reserve stocks for replacement and repair during an extended campaign, represented a substantial ongoing commitment of skilled labor and raw materials that only a genuinely centralized and well-organized state apparatus could sustain. For the close combat that inevitably followed initial archery exchanges once opposing forces closed distance, Egyptian infantry soldiers carried a variety of specific weapons depending on their particular assigned role within the broader formation, including thrusting spears of various lengths, and a visually distinctive curved sword known to modern scholars as the Kadesh, a genuinely formidable weapon featuring a curved, sickle-like blade that had itself gradually evolved over earlier centuries from older battle-axe designs, and that cleverly combined both cutting and hooking combat capabilities within a single integrated weapon, allowing a sufficiently skilled soldier to hook and forcefully pull aside an opponent's defensive shield or weapon before immediately following up with a decisive cutting blow to a now exposed target. Egyptian infantry soldiers also typically carried personal shields for individual protection, generally constructed from a wooden frame covered with stretched and treated animal hide, built tall enough to provide genuinely meaningful protection against incoming arrows and thrown projectile weapons, while still remaining sufficiently light in overall weight for an individual soldier to carry, maneuver, and effectively wield throughout the physical duration of an extended and exhausting battlefield engagement. Personal body armor for the ordinary rank-and-file soldier remained comparatively minimal throughout this period, frequently limited to nothing more than a simple protective kilt or perhaps a basic leather covering for the torso, since more substantial and comprehensive body armor remained genuinely expensive to manufacture in quantity, and would have significantly slowed infantry movement and endurance during extended campaigning in the often brutal heat characteristic of Near Eastern military operations. Officers and elite troops, by contrast, might wear scale armor, consisting of small overlapping bronze or leather plates sewn onto a fabric backing, providing significantly enhanced protection at the cost of considerable additional weight and expense, a luxury reserved for those whose survival was considered particularly important to the overall command structure. The daily life of the ordinary Egyptian soldier on this kind of extended campaign was organized around a routine that had developed over generations of military experience. Soldiers typically marched in the cooler hours of early morning and evening, resting during the most intense heat of midday whenever campaign circumstances permitted such flexibility. Rations consisted primarily of bread, made from grain carried in the baggage train or, when the army was moving through more settled territory, requisitioned or purchased from local populations, supplemented by dried fish, onions, and the thin sour beer that constituted the standard beverage of the ordinary Egyptian diet, both at home and on campaign. Soldiers carried their personal equipment and a portion of their own rations, while the larger bulk supplies moved with the baggage train and the specific organization of march order, with scouts ranging ahead of the main column and rear guards protecting the baggage train from the rear, reflected centuries of accumulated Egyptian military experience regarding how to move a large force safely through potentially hostile territory. But the true elite striking force, the genuinely decisive weapon system of the entire New Kingdom Egyptian military establishment, and specifically the military force that would prove absolutely and dramatically decisive during the unfolding crisis at Kadesh, was unquestionably the chariot corps. The Egyptian war chariot of this particular historical period represented a remarkably sophisticated piece of applied military engineering for its era, consisting of a light, two-wheeled vehicle constructed primarily from carefully selected wood, featuring a floor typically constructed from tightly interwoven leather strips or thongs that provided both structural strength and a meaningful degree of shock absorption as the vehicle traveled at considerable speed across the frequently uneven and unpredictable terrain of an active battlefield. The specific construction of these chariots reveals a genuinely impressive level of engineering sophistication for the Bronze Age. The wheels themselves were typically constructed with 4 to 6 spokes, a design that provided an optimal balance between structural strength and overall weight reduction compared to the heavier, less maneuverable solid-wheeled carts used for other purposes. The wooden frame of the chariot body was deliberately kept as light as possible while still maintaining sufficient structural integrity to survive the stresses of high-speed maneuvering across rough terrain, and surviving examples, along with detailed depictions in Egyptian art, suggest that considerable attention was paid to the precise balance and weight distribution of the finished vehicle, since a poorly balanced chariot would be both slower and more dangerous to operate at speed. Each individual Egyptian war chariot was crewed by exactly 2 men working in close coordination. A dedicated driver, whose entire battlefield responsibility centered on skillfully managing the horses and precisely maneuvering the vehicle through the chaos of combat, and a designated warrior, typically functioning primarily as an archer, who stood immediately beside the driver within the chariot's small platform, and whose specific combat responsibility was engaging the enemy directly, either through sustained archery fire delivered at range or, as the chariot closed distance with enemy forces, potentially transitioning to a spear or javelin for more immediate close-range engagement. This carefully considered 2-man crew arrangement, with its clearly distinct and specialized combat roles, allowed for a genuinely remarkable degree of tactical flexibility and sustained combat effectiveness that collectively made the Egyptian chariot the single most feared and most consistently decisive weapon system present on virtually any Bronze Age battlefield of this general period, functioning in practice something like a highly mobile firing platform capable of delivering concentrated and sustained archery fire while simultaneously retaining excellent overall mobility, capable of rapid advances, carefully controlled tactical withdrawals, and sweeping flanking maneuvers that infantry forces operating alone could realistically never hope to achieve or match. The relationship between an Egyptian chariot driver and his warrior partner was, by necessity, an extraordinarily close working relationship built on extensive shared training and mutual trust. The driver needed to anticipate exactly how his warrior partner wanted to be positioned relative to the enemy, understanding when to close distance for a decisive shot, when to peel away to avoid a dangerous countercharge, and how to navigate the chaotic, unpredictable terrain of an active battlefield while his partner focused entirely on the tactical business of engaging the enemy rather than on the mechanics of vehicle control. Surviving Egyptian military texts and artistic depictions suggest that elite chariot crews frequently trained and fought together for extended periods, developing exactly this kind of intuitive coordination that could mean the difference between life and death in the split-second decision-making that chariot combat demanded. The specific horses selected and trained to pull these sophisticated chariots represented, in themselves, a significant ongoing strategic and economic investment for the Egyptian state and for individual chariot owners alike. Egypt had not historically possessed a particularly strong native tradition of horse breeding during its earlier historical periods, and horses themselves, along with the associated chariot technology as a complete military system, had actually been introduced into Egyptian society relatively recently in overall historical terms, arriving gradually through sustained contact with various peoples originating from Western Asia sometime before the formal beginning of the New Kingdom period. By the specific era of Ramesses II, however, Egypt had developed genuinely sophisticated and well-organized horse breeding and specialized training programs, and the specific animals selected for use pulling royal and other elite chariots were carefully selected for their physical characteristics, methodically trained over extended periods, and, judging from the surviving artistic depictions that have come down to us, evidently represented a matter of considerable personal pride for their individual owners, with particularly prized chariot horses sometimes even given specific individual names that were formally recorded in accompanying inscriptions. Ramesses himself, in his own later inscriptions describing the battle, specifically names the 2 horses that pulled his personal chariot during the crisis at Kadesh, referring to them as victory in Thebes and Mut as content, a level of personal attachment and public commemoration that reveals just how central these animals were considered to military success and, by extension, to royal prestige. The Hittite war machine. Now let's turn our attention across the coming battlefield and carefully examine the formidable military force that Ramesses was about to unexpectedly encounter. Because the Hittite military establishment approached the fundamental art and science of chariot warfare with a meaningfully different underlying philosophy, one that would ultimately prove critically and decisively important to understanding exactly how the coming battle actually unfolded in practice. The Hittite Empire, centered around their heavily fortified capital city of Hattusa situated within the rugged Anatolian highlands, had developed steadily over many preceding centuries into one of the genuinely great military and political powers of the entire Bronze Age Near Eastern world. And by the specific era of King Muwatalli II, the Hittite crown commanded not merely its own substantial native military forces, but additionally an extensive and diverse coalition of allied and formerly vassal kingdoms, a coalition stretching across a remarkably wide swath of territory encompassing much of Anatolia and significant portions of northern Syria, with each individual allied kingdom contributing its own soldiers, chariots, and material resources to the assembled royal army whenever the Hittite king formally called upon them to do so. The Hittite state itself operated according to a somewhat different political logic than the highly centralized Egyptian model. Where Egypt functioned as a unified territorial state under direct pharaonic administration, the Hittite Empire more closely resembled a complex network of alliances and vassal relationships, with the Hittite Great King at the center of a web of formal treaties binding numerous subordinate rulers to provide military support, tribute, and political loyalty in exchange for protection and recognized status. This meant that assembling a major military campaign required the Hittite king to formally summon his various vassals and allies, a process that itself required significant advanced planning and diplomatic coordination, but that ultimately allowed the Hittite crown to field genuinely massive combined forces when the political will and strategic necessity existed to do so. This extensive coalition structure meant that the specific Hittite army ultimately assembled for the Kadesh campaign was genuinely enormous in scale and genuinely diverse in its composition, drawing individual soldiers and complete chariot contingents from numerous distinct kingdoms and peoples scattered across the wider region, all of them nominally united under overarching Hittite royal command specifically for the duration of this particular campaign. Surviving Egyptian records, though likely containing some meaningful degree of propagandistic exaggeration regarding the sheer scale of the opposing force, but probably still reflecting a genuinely substantial underlying military reality, specifically list numerous distinct allied contingents recorded as present at the battle, representing kingdoms and peoples scattered across Anatolia, northern Syria, and, according to some interpretations of the available textual evidence, possibly even including contingents drawn from territories as geographically distant as the wider Aegean world. The specific list of allies recorded in Egyptian inscriptions includes forces identified as coming from Aleppo, from the kingdom of Kizzuwatna in southern Anatolia, from various Syrian city-states, and from numerous other polities whose precise historical identification remains a subject of ongoing scholarly research and debate. The specific design of the Hittite chariot itself differed from the corresponding Egyptian design in one critically important structural way, and this particular design difference would ultimately prove genuinely decisive in shaping how the coming battle actually developed. Where the Egyptian chariot design carried a lighter two-man crew specifically optimized for speed, mobility, and sustained archery fire. The corresponding Hittite chariot represented a somewhat heavier vehicle overall, typically carrying a larger three-man crew. A dedicated driver managing the horses, a warrior armed primarily with a spear or javelin intended for direct close combat rather than ranged archery, and crucially, a third crew member specifically carrying a defensive shield, whose entire battlefield responsibility centered on actively protecting both of his fellow crew members throughout the physical duration of the engagement. This distinctive three-man crew configuration inevitably made the individual Hittite chariot somewhat slower and meaningfully less maneuverable than its lighter, more nimble Egyptian counterpart. But this same design choice also made it considerably more effective and more survivable during prolonged, direct close-quarters combat, since a well-coordinated Hittite chariot crew could confidently close directly with enemy infantry formations or opposing chariot forces and continue fighting. Effectively, even in sustained melee combat conditions, with the dedicated shield-bearer providing genuine ongoing protection while the spearmen engaged the enemy directly at close range, an overall combat approach that the lighter, archery-focused Egyptian chariot crews were, by comparison, considerably less well-equipped to effectively match during any kind of extended close-quarters engagement. The practical implications of this design difference reveal something important about the two civilizations' broader military philosophies. The Egyptian approach reflected a doctrine emphasizing mobility, ranged engagement, and the ability to strike decisively and then withdraw before enemy forces could close distance and negate the advantages of archery, a style of warfare well suited to the kind of open desert and semi-arid terrain that characterized much of the frontier territory where Egyptian armies typically campaigned. The Hittite approach, by contrast, reflected a doctrine placing greater emphasis on shock combat, on the ability to close directly with enemy forces and break their formation through concentrated, sustained close-quarters pressure, a style of warfare that proved particularly effective against infantry formations caught in the open or unprepared for sudden, direct assault. King Muwatalli's specific strategic decision regarding precisely how to deploy this powerful but somewhat less individually mobile chariot force represents exactly what makes the entire Battle of Kadesh such a genuinely remarkable and thoroughly documented case study in effective ancient military deception. Because rather than choosing to deploy his substantial assembled forces in any kind of straightforward, openly visible confrontation that Egyptian scouts might reasonably be expected to detect and report, he instead made a calculated strategic decision that would very nearly hand him one of the single most complete and devastating military victories recorded anywhere in the entire ancient world. The Hittite infantry, while less celebrated in the surviving historical record than their chariot forces, would also have played a significant role in the broader campaign, though the specific evidence suggests that Muwatalli, for reasons that continue to be debated among historians, chose not to commit his full infantry strength to the decisive early phases of the engagement, a decision that may have prevented an even more complete Hittite victory, but that also reflects the genuine tactical complexity of coordinating a coalition force drawn from so many different allied contingents, each with potentially different levels of training, equipment, and willingness to commit fully to what was, after all, fundamentally an Egyptian and Hittite conflict rather than a war that directly served every individual allied kingdom's own interests. The march north. Let's now carefully follow Ramesses and his assembled army as they began their long, arduous march northward from Egypt toward distant Kadesh, because the specific sequence of individual decisions made throughout this extended advance, many of them entirely reasonable and even genuinely prudent when they were originally made in isolation, combined together in a specific and unfortunate sequence to create precisely the conditions necessary for catastrophe. The Egyptian military campaign formally began, according to the detailed inscriptions that Ramesses himself later personally commissioned, sometime in the spring of what modern historians typically and conventionally date to approximately 1274 BCE, falling specifically within the 5th year of his still young reign. The assembled army gathered initially at the fortified frontier city of Charu, located near modern-day Kintara at Egypt's northeastern border region, which had long served as the traditional and customary starting point for major Egyptian military campaigns heading northward into the Levant and beyond. And from this frontier assembly point, the army began the long overland march northward, following the established coastal route through Canaan and continuing onward into Syria proper. A journey that would ultimately have required approximately a full month to complete, given both the considerable overall size of the assembled force and the genuine logistical challenges inherent in successfully keeping an army of this substantial scale properly supplied with adequate food, drinking water, and animal fodder across such a considerable overland distance. The route itself followed what modern scholars call the Way of Horus, a well-established military road that Egyptian armies had used for generations, dotted with fortified way stations and wells that had been specifically constructed and maintained to support exactly this kind of large-scale military movement. Even with this established infrastructure, the march represented a genuinely demanding undertaking, with the army needing to cross stretches of genuinely difficult terrain, manage the health and provisioning of thousands of draft and chariot animals, and maintain discipline and morale across a march lasting many weeks through territory that, however nominally within the Egyptian sphere of influence, could never be considered entirely secure or predictable. The 4 major divisions marched forward in a staggered sequential order rather than advancing as a single tightly compact mass, a practical and largely unavoidable necessity given both the overall size of the combined force and the genuine physical limitations imposed by the available roads and water sources situated along the chosen route of march. But this particular logistical decision would carry significant and ultimately near-catastrophic consequences once actual contact with the enemy became genuinely imminent. The division of Ammonius, with Ramesses himself personally present near its head, led the overall march forward, followed at some meaningful physical distance by the division of Ra, then further back the division of Ta, and finally, bringing up the extended rear of the entire column, the division of Set, with the complete marching formation likely stretched out across a considerable distance, ultimately spanning many miles between its foremost elements and its rearmost trailing forces. This staggered marching order made considerable practical sense under normal campaign conditions. A single road or track could only accommodate so many marching men, chariots, and baggage animals at once, and spreading the divisions out across a longer line of march reduced congestion, allowed each division somewhat easier access to available water sources along the route, and generally made the logistics of an extended march more manageable than attempting to move 20,000 men and their associated animals and equipment as a single compact mass. Under conditions where the location and intentions of the enemy were genuinely uncertain, however, this same staggered formation created exactly the kind of vulnerability that a sufficiently well-informed and well-prepared enemy could exploit with devastating effect. As the advancing Egyptian army drew progressively closer to the immediate vicinity surrounding Kadesh itself, Egyptian scouts operating ahead of the main column managed to successfully capture 2 men who confidently claimed to be recent deserters from the opposing Hittite army, and it is at precisely this specific point in the unfolding sequence of events that the particular chain of decisions that would very nearly result in the complete destruction of the entire Egyptian force truly began to unfold in earnest. These 2 captured men, brought directly before Ramesses himself for personal interrogation, told the young pharaoh something that he was, given his personal ambitions and his eagerness for a glorious military triumph, evidently quite eager and psychologically prepared to hear. Specifically, that the Hittite king Muwatalli, apparently genuinely intimidated by the steady approach of the substantial Egyptian army, had already withdrawn his own forces far to the north, retreating all the way to the distant city of Aleppo, and harbored no genuine intention whatsoever of engaging the advancing Egyptian forces in open battle anywhere in the immediate vicinity of Kadesh. This claim was, in stark and dangerous reality, precisely the exact opposite of the actual truth on the ground. The entire assembled Hittite army, together with its genuinely massive coalition of allied supporting forces, was in fact positioned in careful, deliberate concealment directly behind the city of Kadesh itself, effectively hidden from any possible Egyptian visual observation by the intervening city structure and the surrounding natural terrain features, patiently waiting for precisely this exact moment to strike. These two supposed deserters were, in reality, not deserters at all in any genuine sense. They were instead deliberately planted enemy spies, specifically dispatched by Muwatalli with the explicit purpose of feeding the young, eager, and glory-seeking Egyptian pharaoh exactly the kind of false strategic confidence he most needed to hear in order to induce him into making a truly critical and ultimately near-fatal strategic error. And this calculated deception worked with devastating and almost complete effectiveness. Believing with genuine confidence that the enemy force was now safely distant and posed no immediate threat, Ramesses made a fateful and, in retrospect, catastrophically premature decision. Rather than exercising appropriate caution and waiting patiently for his complete army to close ranks and advance together as a single unified and mutually supporting force, he instead pushed forward aggressively with only the division of Ammonius, moving quickly and directly toward Kadesh with the clear and immediate intention of establishing a forward camp and beginning preparations to besiege or otherwise capture the strategically vital city, while his remaining 3 divisions continued to remain strung out considerably behind his own position, separated by genuinely significant physical distances, entirely unaware that the enemy force they had been assured was safely far away was, in stark reality, positioned close enough to strike against them at any given moment without meaningful warning. The trap springs. Ramesses and the accompanying division of Ammonius successfully reached the general area situated northwest of Kadesh and began the practical work of establishing their forward military camp. And it was precisely here, in the immediate aftermath of this initial encampment, that the true underlying military situation finally began to reveal itself, though initially in a manner that must have seemed, at least at first, like nothing more than an isolated and readily manageable incident rather than the genuine prelude to complete catastrophe. The establishment of an Egyptian marching camp followed well-established conventions that had developed over generations of military practice. Soldiers would construct a defensive perimeter, often using their large shields interlocked together to form a makeshift wall, while the baggage train, chariots, and support elements were positioned within this protected space. The camp Ramesses established this particular day, however, was established under the false assumption of safety, and the normal precautions that might otherwise have been taken more seriously were, according to the reconstructed sequence of events, not adequate to the actual danger the force faced. Egyptian scouts operating in the immediate vicinity managed to capture 2 additional men, and on this particular occasion, under what surviving Egyptian records describe as notably forceful interrogation, quite likely involving some significant degree of physical coercion or punishment, these newly captured individuals revealed the actual underlying truth of the situation. The entire assembled Hittite army, in its full and genuinely overwhelming military strength, was positioned directly behind the city of Kadesh itself, effectively hidden from Egyptian observation, and had in fact been positioned there the entire time throughout the preceding period, patiently waiting for exactly the right strategic moment to strike. This critical revelation arrived at what may fairly be characterized as the single worst possible moment imaginable for the exposed Egyptian force. Ramesses now understood, with sudden and genuinely horrifying clarity, that he had personally marched his own lead division into extremely close and dangerous proximity to the full assembled might of the entire Hittite army and its extensive allied coalition, while his remaining 3 divisions were still strung out behind his position across many miles of open terrain, entirely unprepared for combat and completely unaware of the mortal danger they now faced, continuing to march forward under the mistaken assumption that no immediate threat of any kind existed anywhere in their vicinity. Ramesses, according to the detailed account he later personally commissioned for posterity, immediately dispatched urgent messengers to hurry the following division of RA forward with all possible speed, clearly understanding the desperate and immediate need to consolidate his scattered forces before the numerically superior Hittite army could effectively strike against his divided command. He is also recorded as having summoned his own senior officials and military commanders for an urgent council, sharply questioning them regarding how such a catastrophic intelligence failure could possibly have occurred, and the inscriptions preserve what reads as genuine royal anger and alarm at the realization of just how badly the situation had deteriorated in the span of a few short hours. But these urgent efforts had already come too late to prevent disaster. Even as these hastily dispatched messengers rode out toward the division of RA, King Muwatalli launched his devastating and perfectly timed attack. The Hittite king committed a genuinely massive force of war chariots, described in surviving Egyptian accounts as numbering well into the thousands, in a rapid and violent strike specifically targeting the division of RA as it continued marching forward in standard column formation, strung out along the line of march and entirely unprepared for immediate combat, its individual soldiers marching in ordinary transit formation rather than any kind of defensive battle order, with accompanying baggage carts and various camp followers thoroughly intermixed among the actual fighting men in precisely the disorganized manner that any marching column moving through territory believed to be safe, rather than a force actively expecting imminent battlefield engagement, would naturally and predictably be arranged. The massed Hittite chariots crashed into this dangerously vulnerable and strung-out column formation with devastating and immediate effect. The division of RA, caught completely and totally by surprise, broke apart into chaotic disorder almost immediately upon contact, its soldiers scattering in genuine panic in every direction, entirely unable to form any kind of coherent, organized defensive response against the sudden and overwhelming onslaught of enemy chariots tearing violently through their disorganized ranks. The surviving soldiers fled in whatever specific direction seemed to offer the best immediate chance of personal escape, and many of them, in their desperate flight, ran directly toward the forward camp that Ramesses and the division of Ammonius had only just finished establishing, bringing with them not any form of organized reinforcement but rather sheer chaos, overwhelming panic, and, following closely behind them in active pursuit, the victorious and rapidly advancing Hittite chariot force itself. This specific moment represents the single most critical and genuinely dangerous point in the entire unfolding battle, the exact point at which the complete Egyptian campaign, and quite possibly the personal life of the pharaoh himself, hung in immediate and entirely genuine mortal peril. The forward camp of the division of Ammonius, Ramesses's own personal force, was now being violently overrun by a combined mass consisting of fleeing, panic-stricken soldiers from the already shattered division of Ra together with the actively pursuing Hittite chariots that had just moments before destroyed them, both elements arriving at essentially the same critical moment and creating a scene of absolute chaos, confusion, and genuine mortal danger throughout the Egyptian encampment. The pharaoh alone. The various Egyptian accounts describing precisely what happened next, composed specifically and deliberately to glorify Ramesses and permanently secure his lasting reputation as an unmatched warrior king for all subsequent eternity, describe a dramatic scene of almost superhuman personal heroism. And while responsible modern historians rightly treat this kind of official royal propaganda with considerable appropriate skepticism, the underlying military reality actually being described once careful allowance is made for the obvious exaggeration, still clearly represents a genuinely desperate and remarkable moment of authentic military crisis. According to these surviving accounts, Ramesses found himself, during this critical and rapidly unfolding moment, essentially isolated and cut off, surrounded by rapidly advancing Hittite chariot forces with only his immediate personal bodyguard and various household troops available for his own protection. His main army thrown into complete disarray all around him, the division of Ra already shattered and scattered beyond immediate recovery, and his other two remaining divisions, Ta and Set, still positioned much too far away to offer any immediate or meaningful battlefield assistance whatsoever. The specific Egyptian text known to modern scholars as the Poem of Pentor, one of the primary surviving literary sources describing this particular battle in detail, presents Ramesses during this critical moment as having been essentially and completely abandoned by his own panicking army, surrounded by determined enemies pressing in from every conceivable direction, calling out in genuine and desperate personal appeal to the great god Ammonius for urgent divine assistance and intervention, before personally leading a dramatic series of individual chariot charges directly into the surrounding masses of Hittite forces, cutting his way forcefully through enemy ranks through what the text presents as a combination of sheer personal combat prowess and, in the text's own explicit theological framing, direct and active divine intervention that supernaturally strengthened his fighting arm and personally guided his combat actions throughout the engagement. The text describes Ramesses' prayer in vivid emotional terms, presenting him as questioning why his own father Ammonius would seemingly abandon him at this critical moment, reminding the god of the many offerings and temples he had dedicated in Ammonius' honor, and pleading for the kind of direct divine assistance that Egyptian royal ideology insisted was always available to a legitimate, properly pious pharaoh. This theological framing served a crucial ideological purpose beyond simple battlefield narrative. It reinforced the fundamental Egyptian concept that the pharaoh's authority and success derived directly from his special relationship with the gods, and that any battlefield crisis, however severe, ultimately demonstrated not divine abandonment, but rather the dramatic proof of divine favor once the crisis was successfully overcome. Setting aside for a moment the clearly propagandistic and heavily religiously embellished elements woven throughout this particular account, which was, after all, composed specifically and deliberately to present Ramesses as a semi-divine warrior hero personally chosen and actively protected by the gods themselves, the core underlying military situation actually being described does genuinely align reasonably well with what an authentic crisis of this particular scale would realistically have actually looked like from the perspective of those present. A pharaoh whose lead division has just suffered a devastating surprise chariot assault, whose immediately supporting division has just collapsed entirely and scattered in complete disorder, and who consequently finds himself, along with his personal guard, directly in the path of a numerically overwhelming enemy chariot force, would indeed be facing an authentic situation requiring desperate, immediate, and decisive action simply in order to survive the next several critical minutes, let alone achieve any kind of meaningful battlefield victory. What most likely actually saved Ramesses and the surviving remnant of his immediate forces during this critical moment was not, whatever the elaborate temple inscriptions might explicitly claim, simple divine favor operating in isolation, but rather a specific combination of several more mundane, though equally genuinely important, practical factors working together. First, the Hittite chariot force that had initially struck the division of Ra and subsequently pursued its fleeing survivors directly into the Egyptian camp had, in the natural course of this extended pursuit and the subsequent opportunistic looting of the overrun camp supplies, itself gradually become somewhat disorganized, its original tight formation broken apart as individual chariot crews pursued specific fleeing soldiers in different directions or paused temporarily to seize available plunder from the captured baggage train, rather than maintaining the kind of disciplined tactical cohesion that would have been necessary to press their considerable advantage against Ramesses's remaining forces with maximum possible effectiveness. This particular detail, the tendency of a temporarily victorious ancient army to break formation and begin looting captured baggage, represents a remarkably consistent pattern observed across numerous ancient battles throughout world history, from the Bronze Age all the way through to considerably later periods. The immediate promise of captured plunder frequently proved sufficiently tempting to break even well-disciplined formations, and commanders throughout history repeatedly struggled with exactly this challenge: how to maintain effective tactical control over forces that had just achieved an apparent victory and now faced the immediate, tangible temptation of readily available loot rather than the more abstract, longer-term goal of completing the destruction of a still dangerous enemy force. Second, Ramesses's own personal guard and the surviving elements of the division of Ammonius, even amid this genuinely chaotic and dangerous situation, appear to have successfully managed to rally together around their embattled king rather than simply joining the general panic and complete rout that had consumed the division of Ra, thereby providing at least a stable core of organized armed resistance around which the broader subsequent Egyptian recovery could eventually and gradually be constructed. The specific composition of this personal guard likely included some of Egypt's most experienced and elite soldiers, men whose training and personal loyalty to the pharaoh made them considerably more resistant to panic than the more general soldiery who had borne the initial brunt of the surprise attack. Third, and perhaps most genuinely decisively of all, a fresh and unexpected Egyptian force arrived at exactly the specific moment it was most desperately needed. This particular relief force, sometimes specifically identified within the surviving inscriptions as elite Egyptian troops referred to as the Ne'erin, whose precise specific origin and overall composition remains somewhat actively debated among modern historians, with some scholars suggesting they may have been a force specifically recruited from the region of Amuru or possibly troops that had been stationed separately along the coastal route for logistical or strategic reasons. Arrived unexpectedly from the general direction of the coast, having apparently been dispatched separately from the main army's primary line of march for reasons that remain somewhat unclear from the surviving evidence. And this force struck the now disorganized, plunder-distracted Hittite chariots from an entirely unexpected direction, providing exactly the kind of sudden and unanticipated reinforcement genuinely needed to stabilize the rapidly collapsing Egyptian position and begin the slow, difficult process of turning the immediate crisis around toward eventual recovery. The precise timing and origin of this relief force remains one of the more genuinely debated questions in modern scholarly analysis of the battle, since the surviving Egyptian accounts, understandably focused on celebrating Ramesses' personal heroism, provide relatively limited detail regarding exactly how and why this force happened to arrive at precisely the critical moment it was needed. Some historians have suggested this may represent evidence of more sophisticated advanced Egyptian planning than the disaster narrative otherwise suggests, perhaps indicating that some contingency for exactly this kind of scenario had been anticipated even before the main crisis unfolded. Others view it as simply a fortunate coincidence of timing that Ramesses' propagandists later worked skillfully into the broader narrative of divine favor and personal heroism. The battle turns. With this crucial reinforcement, combined together with the gradual rallying of previously scattered Egyptian troops and the eventual arrival, finally, of the division of Ta, which had been marching some considerable distance behind the site of the initial engagement, the overall battle began to shift meaningfully from what had initially been a near-total Egyptian catastrophe into something considerably closer to a genuine, actively contested military engagement fought on somewhat more equal terms. The continued fighting that followed throughout the remainder of that long day involved repeated and exhausting cycles of chariot charges and countering countercharges sweeping back and forth across the open plain surrounding Kadesh, with both opposing sides making determined attempts to gain some kind of decisive tactical advantage without either force ultimately managing to achieve a truly complete and conclusive victory over the other. The Egyptian forces, having successfully survived the initial devastating surprise attack and having subsequently been meaningfully reinforced by the timely arrival of additional troops, were able to establish sufficient tactical cohesion to prevent complete and total disaster, while the Hittite forces, despite their considerable initial devastating success against the division of Ra, ultimately found themselves unable to fully press home their significant early advantage into a truly total, war-ending victory, in part because King Muwatalli himself, according to some scholarly interpretations of the limited available evidence, apparently chose to hold back a genuinely significant portion of his available infantry forces from full commitment to the main engagement, relying primarily on his powerful chariot forces alone to carry the decisive weight of the battle rather than committing his complete combined military strength to the engagement. This decision by Muwatalli to withhold significant infantry forces has puzzled and interested military historians for generations, since a fuller commitment of combined chariot and infantry forces at the critical moment of Egyptian disorganization might plausibly have resulted in the complete destruction of the Egyptian army rather than the eventual stalemate that actually occurred. Various explanations have been proposed, including the possibility that Muwatalli was being appropriately cautious given the genuine uncertainty of battlefield conditions, that communication and coordination challenges within his large coalition army made a fuller, more rapid commitment of infantry forces logistically difficult to execute at the critical moment, or that he was specifically concerned about overextending his own forces in a way that might leave them vulnerable to a rallied Egyptian counterattack, a concern that, given how the battle actually did eventually stabilize, may well have reflected sound tactical judgment on his part. There exists a specific and revealing detail preserved within the surviving Egyptian accounts, and treated with reasonable scholarly credibility by many modern historians studying this engagement, describing the Hittites attempting a determined second wave of chariot attacks later in the same day, committing an additional force reportedly numbering over 1,000 additional chariots against the now consolidated Egyptian position, and this particular renewed attack, too, was ultimately successfully repulsed, with Egyptian forces, now considerably better organized and more thoroughly prepared than they had been during the earlier catastrophic surprise, managing to hold their defensive ground effectively and inflict genuinely significant additional losses upon the attacking Hittite chariot forces. The Egyptian accounts describe this second engagement in considerable tactical detail, suggesting that Egyptian forces had, by this point in the day, managed to establish a more organized defensive formation, likely incorporating infantry position to provide covering fire and protection for their own chariot forces, a more coordinated combined arms approach than had been possible during the chaos of the initial surprise attack. This second successful defense likely represented the genuine turning point of the battle, the moment at which Egyptian forces transitioned from simply attempting to survive an overwhelming surprise attack toward actively contesting the battlefield on increasingly equal terms. By the conclusion of that day's exhausting fighting, both opposing armies had suffered genuinely substantial casualties, measured both in terms of individual soldiers killed or seriously wounded and in terms of chariots either completely destroyed or successfully captured by the opposing side, and the overall battlefield situation had essentially settled into a bloody, mutually exhausted stalemate. Neither side had managed to achieve the kind of genuinely decisive, complete victory that would have been sufficient to force the other into unconditional surrender or complete strategic withdrawal, though the actual course of that day's fighting had certainly not unfolded according to the original Egyptian battle plan, which had initially envisioned a relatively straightforward advance followed by the siege and eventual capture of Kadesh, rather than the desperate defensive struggle simply to avoid complete annihilation that the day had actually delivered. The following day, according to some interpretations of the fragmentary evidence, may have seen additional limited fighting or at least a tense standoff between the two exhausted armies, though the surviving sources provide considerably less detail regarding this subsequent period than they do regarding the dramatic events of the main day of battle. What does seem clear is that neither side possessed, at this point, the remaining combat strength or logistical capacity to press for a genuinely decisive resolution, and the practical outcome, whatever the competing propaganda claims would later assert, was an effective military stalemate. What the Egyptians claimed. Let's now carefully examine precisely what Ramesses ultimately claimed had happened at Kadesh, because the extensive propaganda campaign he subsequently launched following this battle represents one of the single most extensive and genuinely fascinating examples of sophisticated ancient royal image management preserved anywhere within the entire historical record, and carefully understanding exactly what he claimed helps us considerably better understand what actually likely occurred on that battlefield. Ramesses personally commissioned not merely one but multiple genuinely distinct accounts of the Battle of Kadesh, having them carved and elaborately painted onto the walls of numerous major Egyptian temples scattered throughout his kingdom, including significant installations at Abydos, Karnak, Luxor, and the Ramesseum, his own dedicated mortuary temple complex, along with the famous monumental rock-cut temples constructed at Abu Simbel in distant Nubia. This represents an absolutely extraordinary investment of available royal resources and demonstrates an extraordinary personal determination to ensure that his particular version of these events would be permanently remembered, quite literally carved permanently into solid stone across the entire length and breadth of his empire, for what he clearly and explicitly intended to represent nothing less than eternity itself. The sheer repetition of this particular narrative across so many different monumental locations, scattered across such a vast geographic extent of his kingdom, from the Nile Delta all the way south into Nubia, reveals something genuinely important about how ancient Egyptian royal propaganda actually functioned. This was not simply a matter of recording historical events for future reference. It represented a deliberate, sustained, empire-wide campaign of message reinforcement, ensuring that virtually anyone traveling to any major Egyptian religious center anywhere within the kingdom would encounter essentially the same carefully constructed narrative of royal heroism and divine favor, reinforced through repeated visual and textual exposure across an entire lifetime of temple visits and religious observances. These surviving accounts exist today in two primary distinct forms: a more formal and relatively restrained official record known to modern scholars simply as the Bulletin, and a considerably more literary and dramatically embellished narrative account known as the poem, sometimes specifically attributed to a scribe named Pentor, though this particular attribution remains genuinely debated among professional Egyptologists. And it now appears more likely that Pentor may simply have been the specific scribe responsible for copying one particular surviving version of this text rather than having been its original historical author. Both of these surviving accounts are typically accompanied by elaborate and dramatic visual relief carvings depicting the battle itself in vivid detail, consistently showing Ramesses seated confidently in his war chariot, his bow fully drawn, charging directly and fearlessly into disorganized masses of fleeing, visibly terrified enemy soldiers. The core underlying narrative that Ramesses consistently presented across all these various monuments was one centered entirely on personal heroism, ultimately triumphing decisively over initial betrayal and genuinely overwhelming odds. In his carefully constructed telling of events, he was cruelly deceived by treacherous enemy spies, then effectively abandoned entirely by his own panicking troops, and consequently left essentially alone and unsupported to face the full assembled might of the entire Hittite army by himself, only to then personally and single-handedly turn the complete tide of the battle through his own extraordinary courage, superior martial skill, and the direct, active intervention and unwavering favor of the great god Ammonius, ultimately succeeding in driving the defeated Hittite forces back in disorder and thereby securing what he presented, without any apparent qualification or ambiguity whatsoever, as an unambiguous and glorious Egyptian military victory. The elaborate temple reliefs commissioned to accompany these written accounts go so far as to depict specific, almost cinematically dramatic individual moments of this claimed heroism. Ramesses is shown entirely alone within his war chariot, his bow fully drawn and ready, enemy soldiers depicted fleeing helplessly before him or falling beneath the hooves of his charging horses, with some enemy soldiers even shown desperately attempting to swim across the Orontes River in a futile attempt to escape, drowning in the process, while the broader Egyptian forces, having supposedly rallied enthusiastically around their heroic and divinely favored king, are shown completing the total rout of the defeated Hittite army. One particularly memorable scene depicts a Hittite prince being fished out of the river by his own soldiers, shown being held upside down by his ankles to drain water from his lungs, a moment of almost darkly comic visual detail amid the broader triumphant narrative that reveals the genuinely sophisticated visual storytelling techniques Egyptian artists had developed for this kind of monumental commemorative art. This represents, by any reasonable and objective modern historical analysis, a significantly one-sided and substantially embellished account of the actual events, and there exist several genuinely specific and revealing details preserved even within the Egyptian sources themselves that quietly betray the considerable gap separating this officially triumphant public narrative from the considerably messier underlying military reality of what actually occurred that day. Most tellingly of all, despite explicitly and repeatedly claiming outright victory, the surviving Egyptian accounts never actually claim at any point that the city of Kadesh itself was successfully captured. Ramesses's own explicitly stated primary objective for the entire campaign, namely the capture of this specific strategically vital city, is simply never mentioned anywhere within these accounts as having actually been achieved. The overall narrative instead concludes with the successful defense of the Egyptian encampment and the eventual repulsion of the various Hittite attacks. But the city itself, the actual strategic prize that the entire campaign had originally set out specifically to win, remained firmly and unambiguously in Hittite hands throughout and after the battle. Additionally, the Egyptian accounts include a specific detail that, read carefully, actually undermines rather than supports the overall triumphant narrative. They explicitly describe Ramesses berating his own officers after the battle for having allowed the initial catastrophic surprise to occur, sharply criticizing them for cowardice and poor leadership. This detail, presumably included specifically to further highlight the pharaoh's own singular heroism by contrast with his subordinates' supposed failures, inadvertently confirms that the Egyptian army had indeed suffered a genuine and serious military crisis rather than simply executing a clean, planned victory from the outset, a crisis serious enough to provoke this kind of pointed royal criticism of senior military leadership after the fact. What the Hittites said. Now let's turn our careful attention to the other side of this fascinating historical story. Because while the Hittites did not leave behind anything approaching the same overwhelming volume of dramatic literary and artistic commemoration that Ramesses so extensively commissioned, their own surviving records, considerably more modest in overall scope but genuinely valuable precisely because they represent a completely independent historical perspective, tell us a meaningfully and significantly different underlying story. Surviving Hittite records regarding this particular battle are considerably less extensive overall than the corresponding Egyptian material, consisting primarily of relatively brief references embedded within royal annals and later diplomatic correspondence rather than the kind of dedicated, elaborately triumphant monumental inscriptions that Ramesses so extensively commissioned across the length of his empire. This difference in the volume of surviving commemorative material partly reflects genuine differences between Egyptian and Hittite royal commemorative traditions more broadly, with Egyptian pharaohs generally investing far more extensively in large-scale monumental temple inscriptions than their Hittite counterparts, who tended toward somewhat more modest forms of royal record-keeping focused on administrative and diplomatic archives rather than public monumental display. But what limited material does survive presents the overall engagement in fundamentally and meaningfully different terms than the Egyptian version. Surviving Hittite sources consistently describe the battle as representing a clear victory for their own side, placing particular emphasis on the successful surprise attack launched against the exposed Egyptian forces and the genuinely significant damage inflicted upon them, particularly highlighting the complete destruction of the division of Ra crucially, and this represents the single specific detail that most modern historians find genuinely most persuasive when attempting to determine what actually happened that day. The Hittites retained firm and continuous control over Kadesh itself both immediately following the conclusion of the battle and for many subsequent years afterward. If Ramesses had genuinely achieved the overwhelming, decisive victory that his elaborate temple inscriptions so confidently claim, one would quite reasonably expect this claimed victory to have naturally resulted in actual Egyptian control over the very city that had constituted the entire original objective of the campaign in the first place. Instead, Ramesses and his surviving forces ultimately withdrew from the entire contested region, marching back toward Egypt, while Kadesh itself remained firmly and continuously within the established Hittite sphere of influence. The broader diplomatic correspondence and later Hittite royal records from the subsequent years further reinforce this interpretation, with later Hittite rulers referring back to the events at Kadesh in terms consistent with having achieved a successful defense of their interests rather than having suffered any kind of significant setback. This kind of retrospective reference within internal Hittite administrative and diplomatic documents, not specifically composed for external propaganda purposes in the way Ramesses's temple inscriptions clearly were, provides historians with a particularly valuable independent check on how the battle was actually understood and remembered by the very people who had fought on the other side. Modern military historians, carefully weighing the available evidence from both opposing sides against each other in detail, have generally arrived at a broad scholarly consensus interpretation that differs considerably from Rameses's own extensively documented triumphant claims. The Battle of Kadesh represented, in genuine practical strategic terms, something considerably closer to either an actual Hittite victory or, at absolute best from the Egyptian perspective, a costly and ultimately indecisive draw for Egypt, rather than representing the clear-cut, unambiguous Egyptian triumph that the elaborate temple walls so confidently and repeatedly proclaim. Rameses and his surviving forces did successfully avoid what could easily have become a truly catastrophic, potentially war-ending total defeat, and his own personal conduct during the height of the crisis, whatever its precise specific details may actually have been, likely did genuinely involve authentic personal courage and reasonably effective battlefield leadership during an extraordinarily dangerous and rapidly evolving situation. But the specifically and explicitly stated strategic objective of the entire campaign, namely the capture of Kadesh, was quite clearly not actually achieved, and the subsequent withdrawal of the Egyptian army back toward home territory following the conclusion of the battle remains genuinely difficult to meaningfully reconcile with any authentic claim of truly decisive military victory. The long Cold War, the years immediately following the dramatic Battle of Kadesh, did not, despite the exhausted stalemate both sides had just experienced, immediately bring genuine peace between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Instead, these subsequent years brought a considerably prolonged period of continued, simmering low-level conflict, with both major powers continuing to actively maneuver for strategic advantage throughout the perpetually contested Syrian borderlands without either side ever again risking the kind of massive, potentially decisive confrontation that had so nearly gone catastrophically and completely wrong for Egypt at Kadesh. Rameses continued actively campaigning throughout the broader region over the course of the following several years, and surviving Egyptian records claim various subsequent military successes during this period, including the eventual capture of certain specific cities that had previously fallen under Hittite political influence, though notably Kadesh itself continued to remain outside direct Egyptian control throughout this entire subsequent period. These later campaigns, while individually smaller in scale than the massive Kadesh expedition, reflect the continuing strategic reality that neither power had genuinely resolved the underlying territorial dispute that had originally driven the two empires toward open conflict. Meanwhile, significant internal pressures were simultaneously building within the Hittite Empire itself during this same period, including growing and genuinely serious concerns regarding a resurgent and increasingly aggressive Assyrian power expanding steadily to the east, an emerging strategic threat that would eventually prove far more serious and genuinely existential to core Hittite imperial interests than the ongoing, comparatively limited rivalry with Egypt over contested Syrian territory. Ever ultimately represented, the Assyrian Empire, centered in northern Mesopotamia, had been steadily expanding its own sphere of influence throughout this period, and Hittite strategic planners increasingly recognized that a continued state of active hostility with Egypt, requiring the ongoing commitment of significant military resources to the Syrian frontier, represented a genuinely dangerous strategic overextension at precisely the moment when Assyrian pressure demanded increased attention and resources directed toward the Hittite Empire's eastern frontiers instead. This gradually shifting broader strategic landscape, with both major imperial powers now facing their own distinct and pressing internal and external challenges, and with neither side able to achieve any kind of genuinely decisive lasting advantage over the other within their ongoing Syrian territorial rivalry, eventually created precisely the necessary conditions for one of the truly remarkable diplomatic achievements recorded anywhere within the entire ancient world. The world's oldest peace. 16 years after the dramatic events of the Battle of Kadesh, in approximately 1258 BCE, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, who had personally come to occupy the Hittite throne following a period of significant internal political upheaval that followed in the wake of Mu'tali's eventual death, formally concluded a comprehensive peace treaty between their two respective empires, an agreement that stands today as recognized by most historians as one of the oldest surviving comprehensive written peace treaties in all of recorded human history, predating by many centuries any genuinely comparable diplomatic document surviving from any other ancient civilization known to modern scholarship. Hattusili's own path to the Hittite throne had itself been marked by significant internal conflict, having come to power through what amounted to a successful internal coup against his own nephew, and this somewhat contested claim to legitimate authority may itself have provided additional motivation for seeking formal, stable recognition and peaceful relations with Egypt, since a Hittite king whose domestic legitimacy faced ongoing internal challenges had particularly strong incentives to avoid the additional risks and resource demands that continued conflict with Egypt would represent. This historically significant treaty, known to modern scholars variously as the Treaty of Kadesh or alternatively the Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty, survives today in multiple distinct copies, most significantly including a version preserved on cuneiform clay tablets discovered during excavations at Hattusa, the ancient Hittite capital, written in the Akkadian language that served throughout this period as the standard diplomatic lingua franca of the wider ancient Near Eastern world, along with a corresponding hieroglyphic version carved directly into the walls of major Egyptian temples, including significant installations at Karnak. This dual survival, in two different languages preserved through two entirely independent archaeological and historical traditions, provides modern historians with an unusually solid and well-corroborated textual foundation for understanding the treaty's precise content and significance. The actual specific content of this remarkable treaty is genuinely striking in its diplomatic sophistication and its comprehensive scope. It formally establishes lasting peace and mutual brotherhood between the two kingdoms, with both reigning rulers explicitly and formally renouncing any future acts of aggression whatsoever against the other's sovereign territory. The treaty includes specific detailed provisions establishing mutual defense obligations, with each ruler formally pledging to send meaningful military assistance to the other in the event of any external attack, or, quite notably and significantly, even in the specific event of internal rebellion arising against either respective throne, strongly suggesting that both rulers were genuinely concerned not merely with potential external threats originating from outside their own empires but, additionally, with actively maintaining each other's continued dynastic stability against the ongoing threat of internal political challengers. A concern that, given Hattusili's own recent path to power, likely carried particular personal resonance for the Hittite king specifically. The treaty additionally includes what appears to represent the earliest known formal extradition agreement preserved anywhere within recorded human history, with both signatory parties formally agreeing to return political refugees and various fugitives who might flee from one kingdom into the territory of the other, along with specific detailed provisions regarding precisely how such returned individuals should subsequently be treated, generally calling for reasonable leniency rather than harsh punishment, suggesting a genuinely notable degree of humanitarian consideration built directly into even this remarkably ancient diplomatic framework. Perhaps most strikingly and revealingly of all, The treaty formally concludes with an extensive invocation of numerous deities drawn from both the Egyptian and Hittite religious pantheons, called upon collectively to serve as divine witnesses to this solemn agreement, along with specific formal curses explicitly invoked against whichever party might potentially violate the treaty's established terms at some point in the future, and corresponding blessings explicitly promised to whichever party faithfully upheld its obligations, a formal structural approach that clearly reveals just how genuinely seriously both ancient civilizations took the religious and cosmic dimensions inherent in formal diplomatic commitments of this magnitude, treating any potential broken treaty not merely as a simple political failure, but as a genuine and serious offense committed against the fundamental divine order of the universe itself. This hard-won peace endured, quite remarkably, for the entire remainder of both rulers' respective reigns, and was further meaningfully cemented several years later through an important diplomatic marriage, with Hattusili's own daughter personally traveling the considerable distance to Egypt in order to become one of Rameses's formal wives, a significant diplomatic union that Ramesses himself commemorated with considerable public fanfare in additional commissioned inscriptions. Carefully describing the elaborate journey undertaken by the Hittite princess to reach Egypt and the grand celebrations that subsequently marked both her arrival and her formal marriage. Surviving diplomatic correspondence from this period, including letters exchanged between Ramesses and Hattusili's queen Pujahipa, reveals a genuinely warm and cooperative ongoing relationship between the two royal courts, extending considerably beyond the formal terms of the treaty itself into what reads as genuine diplomatic friendship and mutual respect between the two ruling families. What archaeology and modern analysis tell us. Let's spend some additional time now discussing precisely how modern historians and archaeologists have actually managed to piece together this considerably more nuanced and balanced understanding of the battle, moving thoughtfully beyond simply accepting either side's obviously self-interested official account entirely at face value. The single most valuable resource available to modern historians studying this particular engagement is precisely the fortunate fact that we happen to possess genuinely independent accounts from both participating civilizations, allowing for direct comparative analysis in a way that is actually relatively rare when studying many other ancient conflicts, where frequently only one side's perspective has managed to survive into the modern era. By carefully and systematically comparing the elaborate Egyptian temple inscriptions against the considerably more limited but genuinely independently sourced Hittite records, professional historians can reliably identify the specific points of factual agreement existing between the two competing accounts, points which likely represent the most historically reliable core facts of what actually occurred, while simultaneously treating the points of significant divergence between the two versions, particularly regarding the ultimate strategic outcome and overall significance of the battle, with appropriately calibrated scholarly skepticism toward whichever source's specific claims appear most obviously self-serving. Ongoing archaeological work conducted in the immediate region surrounding Kadesh itself, though significantly complicated in recent decades by the ongoing political instability affecting modern Syria that has substantially limited direct archaeological access to the site, has nonetheless provided some genuinely valuable additional physical context, helping historians better visualize and understand the likely terrain across which this massive ancient engagement actually unfolded. Earlier excavations conducted before regional instability curtailed access had already established the general topography of the ancient site and its relationship to the Orontes River, providing useful geographic context for interpreting the various tactical movements described in the surviving textual accounts. Military historians specializing in Bronze Age warfare have conducted increasingly sophisticated tactical analysis of the battle based on the available textual and artistic evidence, examining questions like the likely formation and movement patterns of the various chariot forces involved, the probable timeline of the day's fighting, and the logistical realities of how armies of this scale would have actually operated across the distances and terrain involved in this specific campaign. This kind of careful tactical reconstruction has helped move our understanding of Kadesh beyond simply accepting or rejecting the ancient sources' claims and toward a more genuinely analytical understanding of how Bronze Age chariot warfare actually functioned as a coherent military system, drawing on comparative evidence from other contemporary battles and from the broader archaeological record of Bronze Age military equipment and organization across the wider Near Eastern and Mediterranean world. The legacy of Kadesh. As we bring tonight's story toward its natural close, let's take a moment to reflect thoughtfully on why this particular battle, fought so long ago over a relatively obscure Syrian city that most people today have genuinely never heard of, continues to matter so significantly to our broader modern understanding of the ancient world, more than 3,000 years after the actual physical fighting itself concluded. The Battle of Kadesh represents, in many genuinely meaningful ways, the absolute historical peak of Bronze Age chariot warfare as a developed military system, the single largest assembly of chariot forces ever reliably recorded within a single military engagement, fought between the two genuinely greatest military powers of their entire age at a specific moment when both empires simultaneously possessed the necessary resources, the organizational sophistication, and the advanced military technology required to project genuinely overwhelming military force across enormous geographic distances. Within roughly a century following this battle, the entire Bronze Age Near Eastern world would collapse into the chaos and widespread destruction of what modern historians term the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period of genuine civilizational catastrophe that would ultimately destroy the Hittite Empire entirely and severely weaken Egypt itself, bringing a permanent end to precisely this kind of large-scale, chariot-centered imperial warfare that Kadesh represents at its absolute historical height. The battle also represents an extraordinarily well-documented case study in the persistent gap between historical propaganda and underlying military reality, a gap that exists to varying degrees in virtually every civilization's self-commemoration throughout the whole of human history, but that is rarely as clearly visible to modern historians as it happens to be in this specific case, where we fortunately possess independent, directly comparable accounts from both participating sides of the conflict. Studying Kadesh carefully teaches modern historians, and more broadly anyone genuinely interested in understanding how history actually gets recorded, remembered, and eventually reconstructed by later generations, an invaluable lesson about the necessity of reading ancient sources critically, understanding the specific motivations and intended audiences that shaped how ancient rulers chose to commemorate their own actions and achievements, and recognizing that even our most detailed and visually vivid ancient historical accounts genuinely require careful, comparative analysis rather than simple, uncritical acceptance at face value. And finally, the eventual peace treaty that ultimately emerged from this initially catastrophic military conflict stands today as one of the genuinely remarkable diplomatic achievements of the entire ancient world, serving as a powerful and lasting reminder that even the most militarily powerful ancient empires, fully capable of the most devastating available forms of Bronze Age warfare, could nonetheless successfully find genuine paths toward lasting peace when underlying circumstances and genuine mutual interest ultimately aligned, creating sophisticated diplomatic frameworks robust enough to endure for entire generations and detailed enough that we can still read their actual preserved words today. More than 3,000 years later, in two different ancient languages, carved in stone and pressed into clay, telling essentially the same story of two exhausted powers who finally chose peace over continued war. Ramesses II would go on to rule Egypt for an extraordinary 66 more years following the dramatic Battle of Kadesh, ultimately becoming one of the longest reigning and most extensively commemorated pharaohs in the entirety of Egyptian history, his name and image carved onto more surviving monuments across Egypt than perhaps any other individual ruler across the nation's entire 3,000-year recorded history. The battle that could so easily have ended his reign in catastrophic disaster during only its 5th year instead became the foundational legend of his entire subsequent public identity. The carefully constructed story he told about himself, carved permanently into stone, again and again, across the full length and breadth of his kingdom, for the remainder of his extraordinarily long and successful reign. The plains near Kadesh remain quiet today. The Orontes River continues flowing steadily through the same ancient landscape where thousands of war chariots once violently clashed in the largest engagement of its specific kind that the ancient world would ever witness. The temple walls that Ramesses so carefully commissioned still stand today, in Egypt, still telling his particular version of the story to anyone who happens to walk past and look up at the carved reliefs depicting a lone pharaoh in his chariot, bow fully drawn, riding forever into legend. Sleep well. Good night.